Great. Well, I will wait while a few people come into the virtual conversation. But for those of you who are here in the room, welcome to the Centre for European Reform. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. It's a great pleasure to be back having in-person meetings. It feels quite strange, actually. So Jordan has already made the announcement about the sensitivity of the microphone. Those of you who are going to have secretive conversations in the back of the room don't, because they will be picked up and broadcast. So let's see if I can find out how many of us have actually filtered in by now. Okay. So if I can start by setting the scene for this discussion, and a reminder, this is an on-the-record discussion, so remember that when you're making your questions or comments. It's quite hard at the moment to think beyond the horrors that we have been seeing as Russian forces retreat from towns north of Kyiv. But this conversation, I hope, will be about the fact that Ukraine is not just a battlefield or a crime scene, but it's a country of more than 40 million people. It's the world's 40th largest economy on a PPP basis. It's one of the world's largest producers of wheat and other cereals. And as such, it's a place where we have to think about the economy, both in wartime and afterwards. It's an economy that took a hit in 2014 when Putin last invaded and annexed Crimea and took over a chunk of the Donbass. It had started to recover, but now the IMF is forecasting that if the war continues throughout this year, we may see a 35% drop in Ukraine's GDP, which is a truly extraordinary figure. I'm hoping that the panel today will be able to give us an idea of what's happening now, what steps are being taken to keep the economy going, including in the crucial energy sector. But perhaps even more important, I hope that they can give us an idea of what Ukraine is going to need for its recovery once the fighting stops, and what the West can and should do to help. So with that as a bit of background, I'm going to ask Vadym Prystaiko, the Ukrainian ambassador, to be our first speaker. He's been the Ukrainian ambassador in London since 2020, and that came after spells as Ukraine's foreign minister and then as the deputy prime minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. So, Vadym, what is the general economic and social situation in Ukraine at the moment? And I mean, we're obviously seeing a lot of pictures from, as it were, the front line. But what's happening? How normal is economic and social life once you get away from the front line and away from cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol and into places like Ivano-Frankivsk or Lviv or places further to the west?
Thank you. First of all, happy to be here with you, and having all of you here around this panel. I will allow myself just to give a very short introduction on what is happening in Ukraine. I believe that colleagues will pick up, and especially the professionals will talk about the economic consequences of this war and where it all brings us. Just wanted also to remind us that this is the 40th day of this war. It's not been for long, it's not years like the Second World War, but although the human losses and the economic losses are immense, we will see how we will get through all of it, and I hope again for this discussion today. But you know, knowing this and seeing what is happening in Bucha, just next to Kyiv, the suburb of Kyiv, more or less, it's atrocities that hundreds and hundreds of civilians just simply tortured and then killed. It brings me to the point when we have to step back for a second and think in human terms. The economy will be able to rebuild. The bridges, the schools and the hospitals and everything which has been already destroyed will be able to rebuild. But what about this loss? What about this development, the delay in development us over the civilization? we still don't have the answer how it will affect Ukrainians. And we've been through a couple of these things already. We've been through very difficult periods of post-Soviet economy dissolution. We've been through a couple of revolutions already. Now we came to the point of full-scale foreign aggression. This is something we have not tried yet, but hope that we'll get through it. Just on a couple of figures which I can bring with me right now. Even according to UN, 6.5 million people already been displaced. I guess this picture even worse, and the number is even higher. 3 million people already crossed the borders, 2+ million in the Poland Republic in just one place. And most of them, unfortunately, going through the western part with just one sort of point where is the bottleneck, where all the assistance, everything is coming through. And unfortunately, all our civilians have to flee using this particular choke point. This 20,000 houses been already targeted, 6,800 of them totally destroyed. 869 educational institutions, 83 are totally destroyed. 135 hospitals, 9 totally destroyed. We believe that there will be hundreds and hundreds of billions to restore the just destroyed infrastructure. Not just people, but businesses, and you rightly started with that. Even businesses are being destroyed. Some of them had to be relocated. We have formal system in Ukraine where you can apply for the relocation of the business to the West, something we haven't seen since the Second World War. And there is 1,500 businesses already applied to be relocated within Ukraine to new places. We know that around 100 of them completed this relocation and started working. And so with some of these companies were already in contact and they started working on a new place, trying to rebuild up the supply chains and the workforce and everything. We count now that the losses by today, and this number was announced already by the Prime Minister, that's around $560 billion lost. And this is a huge sum to Ukraine's economy. You might imagine that it's an astronomical figure, but it's not the end of the picture. We believe that with everything, all the rising employment, trade disruption, declining consumer demand, and deteriorating general economic situation, the figure will climb up to $1 trillion. This is an unprecedented figure, and we have to think how we're surviving with day-to-day operations. But what is more important now is what to do next, how to regain the Ukrainian trade and the Ukrainian economy. You mentioned the effect on Ukrainian grain productions, but the problem is now that we can't even export everything we already accumulated from the previous harvest. And we're talking about very basic stuff, the grains, the corn, the wheat and rye, something we used to feed half of the world with. And we already have a conversation with DEFRA here, with more or less our colleagues in the fight in the global food security, insecurity, that we need simple things like pesticides, herbicides, the seeds themselves, and actually the machineries, because it's so much of it's been destroyed. Some of them even destroyed. We were just discussing that some of the tractors found themselves in Chechnya. So these liberators were stealing stuff. They're stealing water from Ukraine major river on an unprecedented level. And it's not just war against Nazis. They're stealing economical wealth, economical potential, and Ukraine's future. So we started to think with Ukrainian governments what to do with our usual export commodities items like metallurgy. It's 10 times faulted, almost to zero with energy production. But I believe that Maxim will be able to tell us what it was energy. Although we managed at the very last moment to switch into European system, and it allows us to maintain the grid itself. But there are many other things which won't be able to do that easy. So on the sort of rebuild and reconstruction afterwards, we already have a couple of very interesting initiatives coming up from the businesses as well as governments. some of the big businesses coming. The Marshall Plan, these two words again could be heard. And we remember how many times it was discussed before, and to almost no particular effect. I hope this time we will be able to build up something new, not just big account where everybody who is kind-hearted will be able to drop the money in this big bucket, but something which will allow us to rebuild our known nation at a new image. I hope that we will, as soon as we're all, will be able to come together. But my personal view, that Russia has to pay for it. Not Europeans, not United States, not Japan with Australia. Although we still hope that these nations will come to help, but Russia itself. I will allow it to stop here, and we're more than happy to take part in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Well, I think we probably all subscribe to your last point there, but I'm not sure how willing the Russian authorities are likely to be at the moment to do that. Anyway, our second speaker is Kurt Volker, who's Distinguished Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis and a former Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and before that, the US Ambassador to NATO, and somebody that I have had the privilege of knowing for a very long time since I was in Washington. So Kurt, I mean, where do you think the West, and especially the US, now stands in relations with Ukraine? And I mean, picking up what Vadym was saying about it, we all talk about Marshall Plans, but do you think that that the US and the West collectively is in a place to be able to help Ukraine not just survive the war, but win the peace?
Yes, thanks, Ian, very much, and good to see everyone, and good to see all friends here as well, too. Yes is the answer, and it's kind of a surprise to the West that that's the case. They didn't anticipate this, but I'll give you my reasons for answering that way. First off, there was great hesitancy before the war began. The West was minimizing, not looking at what to do, but what we won't do, and advertising it. No real belief that the Ukrainians would hold on. People were predicting the fall of Kyiv in 3 days. Obviously, people didn't know Ukrainians very well, I might add, but that's what the image was. And as Ukraine hung on and made good use of the military equipment that had been provided and was being provided, it started to change minds, started to change the mindset. I think President Zelensky's personal appeals to Ukrainian people, to Western countries, also had an effect on mindsets. And here we are, as Vadym said, 40 days in, and we can draw some conclusions already. The most important conclusion is that Russia cannot win. We've seen it now, we've seen it with our own eyes. They don't have the military capacity to take Ukraine and hold it. They can't, they've even pulled back from the major cities now. After their offensive has stalled out, the Ukrainians blocked the offensive, cut supply lines, and fairly thoroughly were going after the Russian forces on the ground, with estimates that Russia has lost anywhere from 25 to 40% of its combat capability as a result. So there's no question that Russia will not be able to win here, which by definition means Ukraine does. Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent European state. And this is fundamental. And I think that people in the West, including speaking about the United States, I think the Biden administration now gets this. I was just in Brussels last week, had a lot of meetings in Brussels. I think people in Brussels get this. So this changes the paradigm from where they were just 6 weeks ago. Now, what does that mean? It means it's not over yet. There's a lot to do, a lot of military support to be provided to Ukraine. And I think we need to stop drawing lines in the sand about what we won't give them, whether it's artillery or tanks or aircraft. We should start listening to the Ukrainians. What can they use? What do they need? And aircraft is one that President Zelensky has been very clear about. I spoke with some people in the Kyiv territorial defense on Saturday who were saying we need artillery and we need tanks. And I believe them. And so I think we should help to provide these things. And I think the Russian military is in disarray at the moment. So therefore, now is the time to help the Ukrainians as much as possible, because that will make the most difference. We've done a lot, let's be clear now. At this stage, I think the US has committed $2.3 billion to Ukraine's defense. Others have done quite a lot as well. So not second guess what has been done, but recognizing it has been always a little bit late and always not quite enough. And we should catch up. The second thing is, if you take those things that I just said, that Russia loses and Ukraine ultimately wins, then you start thinking about, well, what do we do as a transatlantic community? The most important thing we do is to accelerate the end of the war, which is militarily helping Ukraine, and accelerate the integration of Ukraine economically with Europe. Now, let's put aside any questions of EU membership for a moment. Let's just talk about, we're sitting here with the energy sector. You think about trade, you think about logistics. There's going to be a massive need for Ukraine's reconstruction. I don't think all the assets we seized from Russia will be enough. And so we may need to, and I think people are planning for more than that. But there'll be a massive need for reconstruction and a massive opportunity to help Ukraine reconstruct in a way that aligns it with European economies generally. And this is something that has always lagged in Ukraine up until the war, but now is an opportunity to accelerate that. And I think also what we should be realizing in the West is that this is an advantage. And I say this as a joke sometimes, but I think it is worth thinking about. Ukraine has the best hardened fighters in Europe right now. It also has massive natural resources, energy capacities, minerals, technology. So I think it's a fair deal for the EU to allow Ukraine to join the EU, and for Ukraine to allow NATO to join Ukraine. But I think we have to be thinking that Ukraine is part of us now. Ukraine is, there's no going back. We also have to look at Russia differently. And I detect that people are doing this too. But there's no Russia with Vladimir Putin in charge that can be part of anything anymore. So whether it's the G20 meetings, the EU-Russia summits, summitry with President Biden, Russia will be a pariah as long as Putin is in power. And that means we have to be thinking about a different type of Russia. What is the Russia that emerges after Putin? We should be communicating that we want to see the Russian people have a successful country. We want them to have a normal life, a normal democracy, and that the quarrel that the West has is not with the Russian people, but with their aggression under this authoritarian leader. That means sanctions have to stay in place on Russia as long as Putin is there, and sanctions have to stay in place as long as Russian forces remain in Ukraine. So I think we are at a stage where the Ukrainians are saying, 8 years ago, we settled for a ceasefire, and you told us this would be okay. And that's what brought us to the point where we are today. Never again. The Russian forces have to leave. I would not be surprised to see an agreement to disagree over Crimea, say we won't retake Crimea by force now. But everything else, I think, has to be changed. And then a final thought on this, and I'll kick it back to Ian to moderate us, but some of the consequences on this are actually pretty far-reaching. There's a need for a transatlantic community to lead again. And think about the last time we did. It's been a long time. I could go back to even the Bush administration, who President Bush took office wanting to say no more nation building abroad, and we got then dragged in through 9/11, where we were leading, but in a totally different direction. And then we ended up poisoning the well with the Iraq War. So we were not in a position to keep leading. And then President Obama wanting to pull out and end 2 wars, and President Trump say no more. And even now we were dragged into this one again. So I think now there's a reason for the transatlantic community to lead. I think when we look at what happened in Ukraine, I think we have to conclude that there should not be gray zones in Europe. So as much as President Zelensky is, I think, for good tactical reasons, putting neutrality on the table, to say, look, if it's neutrality that you want, let's talk about it. Because what that proves is that it's not what Russia wants. It has nothing to do with NATO. It's actually about destroying Ukraine. So it's tactically wise to do that. There are models of neutrality that have worked, but I would expect them to disappear in about 3 or 4 months, as Finland and Sweden seek NATO membership and will be granted NATO membership quickly. So I think we need to come back to the question of NATO membership after all of this. You know, the final example, I'm sitting here looking at Lord Robertson. I remember his exam question to me when I was interviewed to work at his office was, what would we do? What should we do about NATO membership of the Baltic states? And I said, absolutely, we have to bring them in. And the reason was that we would not be true to our own values if we didn't, because we laid out these criteria of what countries have to do to join NATO. And there was a whole class of countries applying, but they were the best. So how could we not let them in? And now looking back in hindsight, I think we should be relieved and confident that we did the right thing when we had to do it. That it's now not an issue of their security. And we should be looking at the future of Ukraine and the future of Moldova and the future of Georgia that way. And then finally, we should be working on our economies as well. We've had, in my diplomatic career, I think 3 different efforts to create some kind of transatlantic trade and investment pact. All of them have failed. And it's time to try again and succeed this time.
Great, thank you very much. Well, that's a good positive note on economic cooperation. So Maxim Timchenko, if I can turn to you, you've been the CEO of DTEK for 17 years, is that right? Yeah, a long time. So one of the biggest private companies in the energy sector in Ukraine, and therefore at the moment one of the people most responsible for keeping the lights on in Ukraine. I mean, one of the things that's been very striking for me is the extent to which Russia has focused attacks on civilian infrastructure, whether that's in terms of taking over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station or destroying oil storage facilities and so on. So, I mean, first of all, I'd be interested to hear, how you see the current situation in terms of the critical national infrastructure of Ukraine. But then perhaps even more important, the economic prospects after the war is over, and both what Ukraine needs, but also what Ukraine can offer. And you said some interesting things to me before we started about what it means now for Ukraine to be connected to the European grid, for example. So,
thank you. So I'm Ukrainian, arrived just recently from Ukraine, and I've never been so proud to be Ukrainian and to be representing the Ukrainian nation. I think that we just talk about surprises. Ukraine brought so many surprises, especially to Putin, for the last 4 weeks that nobody could expect. First of all, what our army forces done with Russians, so that they run away from part of our territory, and it's a matter of time when they run away from all the rest of Ukraine. But also the level of our fight at another front line, energy fight. We started this war with the position of instability, not understanding what we need to resist in terms of energy security. So we asked for additional supply of coal. We asked for emergency synchronization and other things. But it turns to completely different situation after 5 weeks. So first, despite of capturing Zaporozhye nuclear power station and Luganskaya power station, despite of constant shelling of critical infrastructure, including this destruction of substations, transmission lines, and power stations, we are in stable supply of electricity in the country. We have a very difficult situation in the regions immediately affected by military operation, like Donetsk region, Kyiv region, where we have Sumy and Chernihiv, where we have about 1,300 settlements disconnected from electricity supply and 1.5 million people without electricity supply for several days or weeks. But we do whatever we can to restore it, to bring lights back, produce as much electricity as it's necessary. And again, what surprised everybody, that being in critical situation with uncertainty at the beginning of this war, now what we have, we managed to synchronize the Ukrainian grid with the European grid in 3 weeks. And it was expected to be synchronized only in 2023 and with a lot of conditions. Now, physically, Ukrainian energy system is part of European energy system. We managed to stabilize production of coal in Ukraine, so that we have more coal than in the last year by more than 2 times, 1.2 million tons. We managed to keep all our power generation in stable operation. And now we are appealing to our European partners to start the export of electricity from Ukraine. Basically, in all these discussions about over reliance on Russian gas and Russian oil, we becoming part of solution of this problem, offering Ukrainian electricity to our European partners, offering Ukrainian coal to our European partners. And by the way, from this week, we start exporting Ukrainian coal because we have more than enough for our own consumption. We're trying to find technical solution to expand export of electricity out of Ukraine. Today, we stabilize production of gas in Ukraine, so we have enough for our own consumption. And today, taking into account the current pricing of gas, we can even think about limited export of gas out of Ukraine to our neighboring countries. And this is what surprised everybody, that Ukraine not only required any import of energy resources, but being in position in war to be exporter of electricity, exporter of energy products. And this is examples of Ukrainian resistance, Ukrainian courage and bravery, that in hard times we behave as a strong and responsible nation and part of Europe. Now talking about future, of course, Ukraine will never be the same as it was before this, and economic terms as well. So what we have to offer to our European partners? First, Ukraine have the second largest resource of gas after Norway. So today we produce about 20 BCM of gas and our consumption about 27. Consumption is dropping. So we will, I'm sure, we will close this deficit of gas in 2-3 years' time. So it means that in 3 years' time, Ukraine have all the grounds to become exporter of gas. The second, we have huge capacities of nuclear, and we should bring new technologies to Ukrainian nuclear industry. And today we are in discussion with Rolls-Royce SMR regarding development and potential implementation of small modular reactors into Ukraine, and developing our nuclear industry and become one of the major exporters of electricity to the euro. I already mentioned about coal supply. Talking about renewables, we have huge capacities to develop renewables in our country. We have very good wind potential, irradiation, access to the grid, land, and I'm sure that Ukraine can become one of the major exporters of renewable energy to Europe. And this is how Ukraine should be positioning itself, not as a problem, but as a part of solution of the problem of Europe. Made strategic mistake to be so reliant on energy supply from Russia, oil and gas and whatever. So in our meetings, our key message now, we need help from our partners. And it's not only about military and armor, it's about economic policy of European countries. It's about embargo on Russian oil and Russian gas. It's about decisiveness of our partners. And this support will be repaid by Ukraine being one of the most reliable partners for Europe in the diversification of energy resources.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, Anders, I should say, by the way, that you told me a while ago that you were retiring, and I was rather skeptical at the time, and I can see that I was right to be skeptical. But you're now a senior fellow at the Stockholm Free World Forum, as I understand it, but still with a kind of affiliation to the Atlantic Council at an arm's length.
Well, I'm retired from my Atlantic Council.
Right, right. You've got a long history of advising countries in transition. So I guess the question is, these are particularly challenging conditions for further transition. But when you hear Maxim painting such an optimistic picture, do you think that's right? And do you think that these are the right sort of priority areas for Ukraine's Western partners to be looking at?
Yes. Yeah, no, but basically I agree with pretty much everything that has been said here before. So let me elaborate on a few things. Most of what Ambassador Prystaiko talked about. So how big are the losses? The Ukrainian government says now $560 billion. It's exaggerated. How can we see it's exaggerated? There's a far too high piece there on foreign direct investment that doesn't take place. So Ukrainian foreign direct investment is $6 to $8 billion in a normal year. Not, I don't remember if it's $50 billion or so in this country. So the losses on the stocks are probably the order of half approximately of that, $200 to $300 billion of what is destroyed and human lives. So these are big chunks of money. Then to that we should add GDP losses. Maxim did not mention it now, but the electricity consumption is down by 35% right now. And normally in the short term, electricity changes are reflecting GDP losses. So we can, on basis of that, say that probably GDP is down by 35% this year. Simply because production is not taking place. And we can elaborate that the IMF has made a forecast that GDP will fall by 35%. Of course, nobody can know. But I talked with Katja here, who's the CEO of Agrarregion, and she said that 70% approximately is being sold now. And that is another measure of how much that is missing. So 30% of a $200 billion economy, that's $70 billion. So we should add to say $250 billion or so, add $70 billion, and we're up at $320 billion. And it's a bit less than the government numbers, but not all that much. And then we come to how should it be paid? And I totally agree with what Vadym said. This is a standard war reparation case. Because of the Versailles peace, reparations have got a bad name. And nobody now remembers that France had to pay higher reparations to Germany after the war in 1871. And reparations were standard in peace agreements in the old days. And it's only that the Versailles peace was so poorly constructed that reparations got a bad name. This is a completely unjust war. For no reason whatsoever. Putin has decided that he wants to take Ukraine, bomb it, and kill as many civilians as possible. As the Ukrainian says that the Russian soldiers can't fight and they don't want to fight. So instead of fighting with the Ukrainian soldiers, they are killing the civilians. And this is completely unacceptable from every point of view. So therefore Russia should pay reparations. Then you of course ask, is this practicable? Yes, it is. Because the G7 have now frozen central bank reserves of Russia of about $400 billion that they have in their central banks. This is not unprecedented. It has happened with several other countries before that have become rogue states. Iran, Venezuela, Libya. It's what you do when you have a country that doesn't obey any international laws. And the total central bank reserves were about $640 billion. What is not frozen of that is $80 billion that is held in the Chinese central bank as yuan. And then the Russians have about $135 billion of gold. And on top of that, they have about $25 billion with the IMF. And the status of that money is unclear. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva claims that Russia will not be able to utilize that. I hope so. But she gave Russia $17 billion in free special drawing rights in August, which is just outrageous. It should never have happened. I wrote about it at the time, and of course nobody listens, why should they? But she also gave, just in case, $910 million to Belarus to cheer Lukashenko up. And this is not what an international financial institution should be doing. So my suggestion is, I wrote an article for Project Syndicate about a month ago, is that this money should be confiscated. Then you ask, can that be done? The answer is yes, but it's complicated because you have various legal orders. The first element is that the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the old Court of the League of Nations, which is now the UN Court for countries, told Russia to withdraw from Ukraine with a majority of, if I remember rightly, 13-2. It was only China and the Chinese and the Russian judges, surprise, surprise, who voted no, and everybody else voted yes. And this was only a preliminary verdict. The final verdict will be something much more. And here, the International Court of Justice should simply say Russia needs to pay reparations for the damage that is done. Then we have a good international legal basis for such a decision of each country that has the reserves. And then they will probably have to adopt the law in each case that this money will be confiscated and used for Ukraine. And then we have a good basis to start with, $400 billion. And that might be as much that is needed. I suggested $320 billion, but of course this is just putting up my finger in the air and see if it feels right, not much more. What should then be done? I would say that we have three different tasks that go together. One is reconstruction, what Maxim talked about. The other is EU accession that we have not really much talked about, but that is clearly on the table now. And then what we always have talked about, structural reforms, build a rule of law and get what has not been sorted out properly done. So how could this be done? We need strong governance. Of course, Marshall Plan was already mentioned here, and this should be a real Marshall Plan. How do you handle such a large amount of money without getting corruption? You need foreign dominance, and that is quite natural if the money is taken over by the G7 countries. Then you add, of course, Ukrainian representatives, but it should be a minority in order to secure the governance, in the same way as you have independent directors in a majority on a corporate supervisory board, and then of course transparency and proper procurement. But Ukraine has a very good electronic procurement system. So these are the components that are needed, and then we should think of exactly how this should come about. And also, as Vadym mentioned, this should not be the only money, and it's not. We are now seeing that the whole West is very upset. I should also take Japan and South Korea are in on this and want to help Ukraine, because this is unacceptable. This is against all the rules of the world. And what we are seeing here is really a war between authoritarian kleptocracy, that is Putin, and democracy and the free world. And therefore, we all have a part in it. And therefore, I see that everybody now is engaged in the West in quite another way. And I hear that Ukrainians are very happy to be recognized as Ukrainians now and are greeted in all kinds of fashions. So this is what I think should be done. We assess the losses properly. We take the Russian money and we get the program of reconstruction and EU accession together with a structural reform and speed it up in a way that has not happened before. The EU does not have to be so bureaucratic. And I think that both President Zelensky and the EU have really started acting like this. And it's important that it is the European leaders that take a command and do not lead it to the bureaucrats lower down. And by the way, thanks to the association agreement that has been negotiated since 2007, Ukraine has done a lot of the elementary legal work lower down. So there are possibilities to speed things up. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. As a former bureaucrat, I would have to say that the political leaders are often very happy to blame the bureaucrats for their own reluctance to make decisions, but there we are.
I have also been a diplomat.
Anyway, I will finally turn to Bob Seeley MP, who has been very patiently waiting and will no doubt have some comments to make on how rude I am about politicians. But Bob was elected as the Conservative member for the Isle of Wight in 2017 after a military career that included quite a lot of time in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's now a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, where he's been a trenchant critic of Russian influence operations in the UK, among other things. So, Bob, I'd be very interested to hear from your perspective what the British role is now. What should we be doing? What should we be doing with our European allies and partners? And what can we offer to Ukraine to ensure that it comes out of this stronger, more secure, more stable and prosperous than it was before the 24th of February and Putin's attack?
Thank you very much indeed. I will try to answer those within the frame of the of the debate about the Ukraine and the economic impact. I would just say it's very kind of you to mention my biog. I lived in Kyiv, so I lived in the former Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union, and just after, from 90 to 94. And my PhD is in the Russian military. So I think a lot of experts are basically trying to explain why they got the Russian military so wrong. And whilst we've been sort of bigging it up as this very successful hybrid beast for the last 10, 15 years, when it has completely failed to do a conventional task. So I think there's some very significant questions about why we were taken in, or was it the fact that actually in a small scale war like Syria, like Chechnya, which is a very ugly and brutal war, and indeed the 2014 hybrid model, the paramilitary violence with the political fronts, actually the Russians did much more successfully. Was this just the scale of the operation was just too far beyond them, and was their reliance on contract and conscript soldiers that they still haven't invested in, was that the critical failing of this time? So I think there's lots of questions there, but maybe not for this debate. I'm just going to talk about the economy, the impact on the Ukraine economy, the impact on the European economy and the world economy. But before I do that, just to make a couple, and I won't talk for more than 5 minutes, I know we want to get questions in. Just for those folks who say this war is over, I mean, on one level, Ukraine won. Ukraine won after 2 weeks, and that was increasingly obvious. But for Ukraine to win this war, the Ukrainians have to win every stage, because this war is being fought on their soil, not on Russian soil. The Russians, realistically, to have a fighting chance of a face-saving peace, that's not what they wanted, but have a fighting chance of a face-saving peace, the Russians need to win one stage. And there's at least one, if not two more stages, plus complex negotiations to go. So we were underconfident at the beginning of this war. We are in danger of being overconfident now. And I would just say there is a lot of water that's got to flow under this bridge. For example, the Ukrainians, their repair facilities are being bombed. So their ability to repair kit is limited. They're taking a lot of kit from the battlefield, but getting that to a repair shop and actually turning it into something that's usable is a very big if. And every time the Ukrainians lose a piece of kit, they're pretty much losing that kit forever, because it's very difficult for that to be replaced. I'm talking about BTRs, armored personnel carriers and tanks, where the Russians can keep shipping in stuff, and they can keep shipping in mercenaries, which they're doing at the moment, and they're shipping in conscripts, however badly conscripts have done. So there is a significant deep resource still on the Russian side, which we can underestimate. So I would just say that. As regards Anders' points, I think he makes a fascinating argument about reparations. I would just say that limited wars end in negotiations. This is not really the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 or whenever it was, the First World War. We are not fighting Russia to the ground here. This is not a post-nuclear Holocaust. This is a vicious, large-scale, limited war, and they end in negotiations. And the idea that the Russians are going to be happy to pay reparations, I'm afraid, I think is just going to encourage them to escalate up. And that comes back to the fact that this war has got some way to run yet. So I think it's just worthwhile making those points. When it comes to the impact on the Ukrainian economy, we've heard from various experts that it's going to be profound. The Ukrainians are fighting, this is their 1940, this is their World War II. They're fighting for their lives, and they will pay any price. And I would suggest at the end of this, actually, the Ukrainians are going to come out with a very deconstructed country, but they are probably going to end up being members of the European Union in all but name. And I think the European Union, in part because of their moral failure, and especially that of Germany, I think is probably going to have to sign something pretty generous, a very considerable support package, a Marshall Plan, which is going to be led by the European Union and, with considerable input from the UK, from Canada, possibly countries like Japan and China and the United States as well. I don't think, again, I think offering NATO membership immediately, I think again will be difficult. And I would just say on that, Ukraine is going to be free when it has the ability to defend itself and has a state worth defending. And arguably, it's sort of got both of those, not in a perfect form, but it's got its state, and enough Ukrainians think it's worth defending. And it's got, most importantly, with a bit of help from the West, the fighting morale to defend it. And it's extraordinary. The narrative in Russia was always that we've got these sort of Russian tough soldiers, against these sort of some sort of dim-witted Ukrainian peasants, sort of, you know, rather docile, foolish people who we can lord it over. That's the Russian narrative effectively over the last 20 years. What we've seen in the last month is just very professional, very robust-looking Ukrainian soldiers, you know, taking prisoner of these sort of very scrawny looking Russian recruits, Russian soldiers looking very sorry for themselves. So that narrative, that Russian narrative has absolutely been shot to pieces. Ukraine will be free when it has the ability to defend itself, not when it signs treaties with nations who've been unable and unwilling to defend it in the past. So again, I would not oversell NATO membership here, because that's not what's going to keep Ukraine free. The impact on the European economy, I think, is potentially really fascinating. I think Germany, a deeply reckless and irresponsible and selfish energy policy, is now massively coming home to roost. And I think there is going to be some significant issues about German energy policy and a rush to find replacements for Russia, which again, I think is going to decouple Russia from the Western economy. I'll come to that in a sec. German businesses likewise will take a very, very extreme hit. There'll be some impact on the City of London, and there's probably not going to be a great deal of sympathy with either the German businesses who've supported closer relationships with London, or indeed, sorry, with Russia, or indeed the City of London. I think the wider point for the world is you're beginning to see not only the separation of Ukraine from the Russian economy, which I think began really in earnest from 2014, but you're looking at the partial separation of Russia from the world economy. And for me, the big question is that going to be followed by the separation of China from the world economy as well? And for those people who sort of tut and say that's not a sophisticated reading of the world economy, I would just say, you know, 3 months ago, most people would say the Russians aren't going to evade. And in fact, the Russians were continuing to develop a major role in the world economy. And I think this is a wake-up call for Western dependence, be it on Russian energy or indeed on Chinese trade, on our dependency on Chinese trade as well. And in the same way that the last 10 years have maybe shown up, and I think a couple of previous speakers mentioned this, the battle between, I think it was Kurt indeed, the battle between open societies and closed societies, and that is now going to kick off in earnest. You're wondering if that's now going to be accompanied by a splitting of the world economy and indeed the social order, social media, etc., into an authoritarian sphere of influence, which is Russia, but also China, and China will dominate that sphere of influence. And, you know, Huawei as well, for example, selling into to Moscow now, that so many Western companies will pull out. You're wondering whether that sphere of influence in social terms, in freedom terms, in political terms, is now going to be hived off economically as well. I'm going to leave it there, apart from the saying, actually, I think potentially if Ukraine could win this, and it does need to win every stage, I think Ukraine now is pretty quickly going to become an increasingly influential part of the Western world. But, you know, there is some way to go before that actually happens.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that last point is one which I would very much endorse. I mean, I think though it is forged in the most awful circumstances, Ukraine has changed its image and its reputation in the West over the last 5 or 6 weeks quite dramatically. So with that, let's move on to the question and answer. So obviously, if you're in the room, just raise your hand and I will come to you. For those of you who are online, preferably raise your electronic hand. If for some reason, and we'll unmute you in that case, if you're in a place where you can't easily do that, then if you put a message in the chat, with a bit of luck, the technology will allow me to see, well, I say this because this is coming up on my iPad in a slightly odd format, but with a bit of luck, I will be able to see that you have posted something in the chat and I will read out your question for you. So would somebody in the room have a question to start us off? Gosh, dead silence. Well, perhaps I could come back to you, Maxim, since you have been recently on the ground in Ukraine, to ask you. I mean, apart from DTEK and your facilities, I mean, there's a lot of Ukrainian heavy industry, which is in those eastern areas which the Russians have been attacking. how much of that is industry that can in principle be moved further west, and how much of it is industry which is in effect now, going to have to be rebuilt literally from the ground up? So just how big is the hit to Ukraine's productive capacity?
Yes, as you know, the major part of our industrial developments are in eastern part of Ukraine, how it was designed initially. Basically, steel plants or power stations were built close to resources like iron ore or coking coal. And Mariupol is the heart of our metallurgy and our steel industry. Basically, two major steel plants located in Mariupol. Definitely, there is no chance that we can move them from that territory to any other place, and it should be reconstructed and rebuilt. But another example is machine building. Basically, we have two plants located in Kharkiv region and the Donetsk region, and now what we are doing to keep supplying equipment for our coal mining, we move this equipment to western part and to Poland, and now we're building some arrangements with our Polish partners and joint venture to relocate and keep production. So a lot depends on what kind of industry we are talking about. If it's heavy industry like steel production, there's no chance. But if it's something that like machine building developed in Kharkiv and the United States.
Yeah. So Nick Butler first, and then I answer.
Ian, I don't think you got an answer to one of your questions, so I'll ask it again as to what people think the UK could most usefully do now. We seem to have exported a certain amount of military equipment and a lot of rhetoric, and I wonder if people think there are really substantive things we ought to be doing now, alongside people in Europe, but as an individual country as well.
That's a very good question. So I'm going to let everybody on the panel answer that question briefly, and then I'm going to ask Bob Seeley to comment on the answers. So Vadym, why don't you say, what do you, I mean, you're the ambassador here. So
I was expected to say how happy I am, right?
you're expected to say what's on your shopping list apart from military equipment.
It is long shopping list, even with the military equipment, and I'm happy to report that it's not just shopping here within the nation itself, but this nation is helping me to collect the stuff all around the globe. And these donor conferences will be done by the government of the UK, where so many of the other nations are sitting around the table virtually or physically, and actually saying, you don't have tanks, what can you treat soldiers with it? You can have this. What about logistic possibilities? Maybe you can repair Ukrainian tanks. Maybe you start producing the old ammunition which is needed right away for Ukrainians, and you lost this capability some time ago. Maybe you can provide the satellites imagery for, and so on and so forth. This is something which is needed right away, and this is helping enormously. On the sanction, there is a different side. The city was mentioned a couple of times, and mostly in sort of negative connotation, but that's where the most of the information is. That's what DTB Bank was arrested with 42, if I'm not mistaken, $1 billion here. That's considerable money, to think of these resources. Same with the support we are receiving. And I'm shipping from here food. It's very difficult to believe that Ukraine, as the breadbasket supposed to be of Europe, now is begging for food, and food is coming from here in boxes, and the trucks, 50 trucks are rotating each and every day, going there with bringing all the stuff, and more of it. So I'm reasonably happy with what's been done. There is always room for improvement, but that's where we're heading, all of us. Thank you.
Sorry, can you pass me the remote control, because it's telling me that the TV is going to turn off. Yes. Okay.
Just any button.
Any button. If
Yes.
you can find a button that says OK.
That's not bad.
Okay, maybe that'll do it. Okay. Sorry about that. Evidently, the help that I need is entirely technical. Anders.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Bob Seeley's point about reparations, that it's not realistic. Now it is realistic because it's an international court of justice where Russia does not have any veto that would give the international legal statement. It's not the Security Council of the UN. And the money is there. $400 billion is frozen now in the G7 countries, and then it can be adopted in by law to confiscate, and there we would have the reparations. Then you ask what are the legal possibilities in different countries. In the US, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. I think it's quite possible in the European countries and in Japan.
And in the UK?
I'm not so sure about UK. It might be the same problems as in the US, I suspect. But I don't know.
So we are working, we have meetings specifically designed to resolve this particular issue.
Interesting. Maxim, what do you most want from the UK?
In short term, it's mostly from the list we provided through the Ministry of Energy, list of materials and equipment like generators or cables to increase the supply. This is the most needed now for the areas where we heated by military operation. In the long term, what is important for us is this strategic discussion. Like I already mentioned, Rolls-Royce small modular reactors did not stop. That Ukraine is not excluded from the list of countries where such a complicated technologies could be deployed. And I think that if we continue these talks even on the current conditions, that Ukraine can turn to be one of the leading companies deploying newest nuclear technology in power generation. So I think that in both terms, we already today we feel that the United Kingdom one of our major partners, and in spite of some other European countries, UK stands with Ukraine, and we all feel it. But in a strategic view, I think it's important to put or keep Ukraine on the corporate map of UK companies.
Yeah, if I may, just supplement words, Maxim, just to give you a sense of what UK is doing. We had a need of 1,602 generators. That was the list from through the Ministry of Energy. UK provided 800 of them.
Gosh, that's
Half of all world's need what we wanted. And actually, frankly speaking, that's all free of charge for Ukrainians. That's all supported by UK's money. This is real stuff. It's not just a conversation about political support. That's half of everything we needed.
That is quite remarkable. Kurt, did you want to add anything?
Move on.
Okay, then I will move on to Ivan.
I was actually also almost would add one more thing what UK could do. So I'm a farmer actually since 2007. So in between I was also Minister of Economy and CEO of Ukробronprom, and I'm the chairman of the farm. My wife is the CEO, and we work on 41,000 hectares, mostly around Kyiv. Only yesterday we recovered 8 missiles from our field, which complicates a bit our sowing campaign. It's Uragan, it's Smerch, it's Caliber, all types of sophisticated and not so sophisticated. So speaking on behalf of all farming community, how UK can help is there is $12 billion worth of grain in silos sitting right now. Every month, Ukraine would ship 4 to 5 million tons through ports, which are closed right now. Other routes through Romania and Poland is only a tenth of that. So we would be shipping out grain from last year for the next 4 or 5 years, unless ports open up. So as an older maritime nation, UK could obviously help somehow, put effort in opening the Black Sea, so to say. We're talking about mostly closing the sky, but now we're also saying open the Black Sea. So putting some effort, there is already some discussion. Putting NATO ships there and saying this is a humanitarian convoy to feed the world, Egypt and Bangladesh and Pakistan and so on. Making sure that Ukrainian economy is not totally crippled with this type of ban, but also later, if and when the peace comes to Ukraine, is going to be major effort that is needed also from the UK, I would assume, to demining the Black Sea, because there's a lot of sort of dangerous stuff that is floating around. So I hope UK will specifically help on that issue as well.
Well, I mean, I'd quite like to get your comment on that, because the UK does have mine countermeasures vessels. Is that something that we should be thinking about already, or is it a longer term issue, or something we should be doing in concert with NATO, or what?
Okay, just to answer the 3 points. When it comes to, there was a lot of rhetoric. You're right, there was a lot of rhetoric. We were late to the party. There were, there have been people in the West who have been trying to highlight this problem. And unfortunately, because it was too difficult to change, and really the threats of this new darker world have been floating around since 2007. And I'm afraid to say that the European Union nations, United States, Canada, we didn't take them seriously enough. And that's partly the reason we're in the mess that we're in now. That doesn't excuse, Putin is responsible for this war, but could we have done more to deter? Probably. And has deterrence failed? Then clearly it has. So I have to say I pay credit to Ben Wallace, because he's basically saved this nation's blushes by supplying the NLAW, the anti-tank kit, which has gone down very well, and he did that 2 to 3 weeks before the start of the war. And as the Vadym, the Ukrainian ambassador, knows, he's been asking MPs like myself, why can't we buy lethal kit? We're desperate to buy lethal kit. He was asking me, a year and a half ago about that problem. And when I went back to the MOD, they kept finding one excuse after another. Just before the war started, I said, let's send them an anti-air kit as well. And I was given some cock and bull story about why we couldn't. A month later, we're sending them air kit. So that's great. I wish we could have done this 6 months ago, because if we'd armed, 3 years ago, because if we'd armed the Ukrainians 3 years ago, much more aggressively than we did now, and the Germans actually, decided that they might do something about the dependency on Russian raw materials, I don't know, would it have done something to deter Putin? Maybe, maybe not. There is, however, a long list of military kit. I have the list on my phone because I've been sent it by friends in Kyiv, in the close to government in Kyiv. That list went straight off to Downing Street, and I said, have you got this list? And they said, yes, we got it the day before, and it was the basis around the arms supply conference that was held last week. So we are supplying kit ourselves, and the ambassador's been generous enough to give some examples of military and dual-use kit and generators and good things like that. And where we can't supply that kit, we will help ship it. We will help ship it to Ukraine as well. So we are doing the right thing, albeit belatedly, and we now have to keep doing the right thing. When it comes to the sea, very, very good point about closing the sea. Harpoon missiles, we should be, frankly, we need to prosecute this war as speedily as possible. I would just say, actually, the Ukrainians have got some pretty good kit themselves. So the Stugna P anti-tank kit is it's bulkier than the NLAW and bulkier than the Javelin, but you can stick it on a tripod, you can sit 50 meters away and operate it, so you don't have to sit with the weapon. It's got a range of 3 miles, and I'm wondering if the Ukrainians could be trying to use that against anti-ship capability, because if it can hit a tank, it can hit a ship, and it can hit a ship up to 3 miles out to sea. So that I would be surprised if Stugna P was not being located around Odessa and that bit of the Black Sea as we speak. When it comes to minesweepers, we don't have enough. You're talking to somebody who thinks investment in defense is a good idea. Surprise, surprise. I wish we had more minesweepers, because they're amongst the best in the world. I think we have between 3 and 5 at any one time in the Arabian Gulf, or the Persian Gulf, sorry, keeping the Persian Gulf free of mines. Should those ships be going to the north of the Black Sea after this war? For sure, but then somebody's going to have to fill in and do the minesweeping role in the Persian Gulf.
Right. Yes. Trade-offs, always trade-offs like that.
Let me just make about this, just one word about the minesweepers. We have 2 of them staying in the docks waiting until we finish. It's been refitted for us. And it was the contract which we signed just last autumn. 2 of them, sundown classes, were staying, waiting until we already even have money for them. We just didn't have enough time to finish them. So this is in the process. What also is important, we can actually use anti-ship missiles. And Ukrainians are not afraid of hitting all the ships, Russian ships, standing in Black Sea. We need some additional rockets, but not many people believe that anybody will have a stomach to use them against Russia. We, the nation, which can actually do that.
So where are your Sandown class mine hunters at the moment?
They're standing docks up north in Scotland.
Oh, in Scotland. Okay, right. Yes, rather a long way away from the action.
But they actually they planned, they paid.
Yeah.
We have UK facility for support this effort, which didn't have enough time. And we should have started this, as Bob rightly saying, we should have started earlier. By this day, we will be able to use them.
Right.
And just on that point,
Yeah.
Sandown, as some of you may know, is a town on the Isle of Wight.
A good point. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Ian, can I ask a question / comment on the naval issue?
Yeah.
Because what we're talking about here is the area between between Crimea and the far western shores of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast,
Yeah.
which are Ukrainian waters or international waters. So I think it is a big question for UK, US, NATO. Shouldn't we be insisting on the right of passage through international waters? And what if we were to say we should have a port visit to Odessa, to an independent, friendly country? That would challenge the Russians to say, are you going to mess with NATO forces or not? And it would give us an opportunity to bring a minesweeping vessel or two with us.
The Russians have put 400 mines there, reading the press.
Yeah.
But to take your example even further, I was discussing whether we can try to think of airdrop of food to Mariupol. People are just dying over
Yes.
there. We can think of it. I understand that there's danger and everything, but that's as humanitarian as you can get.
Yes.
That's an interesting question. I'm rather attracted. I mean, I thought actually from the beginning that NATO should have offered convoy facilities for civilian ships in and out of Odessa. But we are where we are. That was before 400 mines had been
Sure.
shot.
But
Yeah.
something's going to happen to those mines someday. Why not now?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I just rather that they weren't detonated on the bottoms of any passing ships. Sorry, George Robertson was the next question.
I just wanted to say what Kurt said originally, that this invasion is not about NATO. It's about the destruction of Ukraine, the absorption of Ukraine into some messianic idea that Putin has of the greater Rus. But down the line, people are now talking about an eventual settlement, despite that fact. And President Zelensky has talked about neutrality with some degree of safeguards that would be involved. But I wonder whether European Union membership is actually not a bigger issue in the Kremlin than NATO membership. After all, he's got 7,000 nuclear weapons, so NATO membership is of no real sort of relevance in terms of Ukraine, whereas European Union membership started all this off. It was the association agreement, which was offered to Yanukovych at that time. And the European Union membership seems to me to be a bigger threat to the Putin model of sort of leadership and the authoritarianism. And I just wonder when eventually we get to the talking about an ultimate settlement, whether or not it's not the question about Ukraine staying out of NATO, but actually staying out of the European Union that might be the biggest block to any final deal.
I mean, if I can take the chairman's privilege, I think that's an interesting observation. I don't think Putin has ever understood the EU. And he's not the only one. The UK is full of people who didn't understand the EU. But it does seem to me that to the extent that he has thought about it at all, and he did in 2014, you're right, that he did not like what it had to offer in terms of changing the direction of Ukraine's development. So I think you make a very good point there, but I don't know whether anybody else, perhaps Anders, do you want to?
Yeah.
And I can see Bob wants to as well. But Anders first.
Putin very clearly changed view of the EU in June 2013. And it was a sudden change in the official rhetoric on the EU previously. They had ignored it completely. And Ukraine had negotiated the association agreement since 2007. And all of a sudden, now it was important. And three of pro-European big businessmen were sanctioned in July 2013 because they were pushing the EU agreement. Sergei Taruta, Viktor Pinchuk, and Petro Poroshenko. But recently, Dmitry Peskov said that they had no objection to the European Union. And I think that refers back to what Ian just said, Putin doesn't understand the EU. So it's quite
the same guy who said they weren't going to.
yeah.
Well, there is that.
Yeah. So it's a good saying, but don't believe anything until the Kremlin has denied it. But I think it means something in this case, so that they are not very clear on what the EU is, but so that they have the same view of the EU as a certain Brexit, Brits or Americans by and large. The people outside of the EU by and large doesn't understand it.
Sorry, Bob, you wanted to add something on that?
Yeah, I mean, Lord Robinson, as ever, makes a very good point that actually it was one of the narrative, one of the theories here is that the EU was the battleground. And the EU was always going to be a vehicle in Putin's mind for the fact that we had taken their Warsaw Pact, now we took their Baltics, and now we were taking their Ukraine. And it was the EU that was the vehicle for the Western theft of the Russian sphere of influence. So, I mean, making that point in this country is slightly difficult because then you get into a whole sort of, you either get obsessive Remainers or obsessive Brexiteers banging on about their obsessions. But actually the EU potentially, and the EU's thoughtlessness, did maybe help us stumble into a crisis. Although, as we probably know, this was a crisis that was going to happen in some form or other anyway, because the issue is not the EU and NATO, but it's the issue of Ukraine leaving Russia's sphere of influence and effectively leaving Russia's empire after 250 years. So that is the great issue. It's also been suggested that Putin was sensible enough to understand that he couldn't get the Russian media, well, the Russian people voted by the idea of the EU as a threat, because Russians didn't necessarily see the EU as a threat. And that's where the reinvention of the NATO bogeyman came in, that NATO was the threat here, despite the fact it was primarily the European Union. In spite of that, I think that the way to progress a relationship post this war with Ukraine has got to be with the European Union first, in part because if NATO is not willing to fight for Ukraine, and it wasn't before, then actually it is dangerous for NATO to sign treaties that it's not willing to see through. That's why Ukraine's best defense is always going to be its own people, guaranteed by the ability for us to flow supplies and weapons when it needs into its own country, into Ukraine in times of war.
Yeah, very much agree. Vadym, you were the Deputy Prime Minister for European as well as Euro-Atlantic integration. I mean, did you ever get any sense of, whether the Russians just objected to anything that Ukraine did that was not the Eurasian Economic Union and the CSTO, or so, did they have any particular appreciation of what it was that they didn't like about the EU, apart from the fact that they didn't control it?
I also was chief of the mission of Ukraine to NATO.
Of course.
So I understand the problem here. And I remember that before 2008, before this Bucharest summit, I had a very difficult conversation with, at that time, chief of Ukrainian EU negotiation. I was negotiating for NATO, and my beloved friend, Pavlo Klimkin, who became later Minister of Foreign Affairs, he was an EU sort of guy, was promoting EU. And he was so unhappy with me because we are coming to 2008 and EU was not even on the horizon at that time. That, with your NATO effort, you were just hampering our success in the EU. And I said, listen, you don't understand. The problem is that NATO is becoming very real. we're coming to 2008, we can be invited to membership action plan, and so on and so forth. While your EU, with all due respect, is so far, far, far. That's why it's not putting the president in danger for Russians yet. As soon as we get there close, dear Pavlo, we'll have the same problem with EU. That's exactly what happened. In 2013, we refused to sign because Russians came on this particular one. That was the end of the cycle. Now we realize. And you know, when I hear now that the EU is fine, even Russians, we are supporting Ukraine in EU. And then I hear Lukashenko is supporting our way to EU. That I have to start worrying.
Yeah, that is definitely a reason to worry. Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, so I have one more question, which is from Arnab Das, who is online and hopefully can unmute himself. Arnab, can you, there you go, yeah.
Great, thanks very much for the discussion, and thanks, Ian. I have a question in general. I think we're discussing this and couching it as an issue of democracy and democratic countries versus authoritarian countries, and of course, the reasons are clear why. But there's much discussion about how a number of developing country democracies, as well as authoritarian countries, are not so much on board. So not just China, right, but India, South Africa, and others throughout Africa. And so I wondered what you think of that division. Is this becoming the West versus the rest? And correspondingly, I was intrigued by the idea that China, although it's been apparently studiously neutral, might contribute to the reconstruction of Ukraine that I think Bob Seeley suggested. So I wondered what your comments were on those two fronts. Thank you.
Perhaps I could start with you, Kurt, on the question of, is this the West versus the rest?
Well, I think it's a mistake to put it in those terms that leaves everybody forcing to be saying I'm one or the other, because they don't see themselves as one or the other. But in terms of economic systems and security systems, those are the two systems. And so I think we in the West do have to look at, okay, China, I think Bob said this, creating an alternative security arrangement, or trying to do in the world, an alternative global economic order. And we have to recognize that that is a direct challenge to our societies, our values, our interests, and why it's imperative for the West to organize itself and project. I don't think we should reflexively assume that an India or a South Africa is just going to leap up and say, yes, me too. I think it's competition in a way, and they have their own distinct interests that are neither Western nor Chinese, they're Indian. But I think in terms of the way we read this ourselves and what we do, it is a matter of reinforcing the West.
But I mean, US administrations of both political hues have put an enormous amount of effort into getting a better relationship with India. And yet it feels like when the chips are down, India is still clinging to its old relationship with Moscow more than its new relationship with Washington. I mean, is that unfair?
No, it's not unfair. But I don't think it's out of affinity. I think it's out of a calculation that we're not going to lose the US. We're not going to lose our relationships in Europe. We have some things we need to do with Russia. So I think it's more an Indian-driven calculation and not an excuse on our part to say then write them off or demonize them. No, quite the opposite.
I mean, Maxim, either your company or the Ukrainian economy more generally, what sort of relationships do you have with countries like India and China? I mean, in the agricultural area, Ukraine is a massive supplier to the Middle East and North Africa, and some of these countries are very, very dependent on your supplies. But I mean, in general, do you have the kind of economic ties with those non-West but not pro-Russian countries that would be helpful in these circumstances?
Yes, talking about us and about our company, we had some limited relationship with them. So China is well known as a key supplier of solar panels for our renewable projects. And recently we developed partnership with India to supply some equipment for coal mining. So that's an example. Our sister company Metinvest have quite strong trade relationship with them as a key exporter of steel and iron ore to China. So that's what was in the past. For me, it's difficult to comment what will be in the future. So it all depends on when this war is finished and what political agreement, including participation of such countries like China in this further development. And I think in any case, it's one of the largest markets for us to consider for the future. And if we go in that talking that Ukraine will stay very much integrated in the global economy, probably we cannot avoid to build such business relationship with this market.
I mean, I'll come to you in a moment, Anders, but Bob, I wanted to ask you, you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which has looked at the relationships with some of these countries. I mean, do you feel that there is more that we could or should be doing to engage them on these issues?
Well, I mean, yes and no, but I mean, that's such an open-ended question. The Republic of Ireland stayed neutral in World War II, but that didn't necessarily mean they were pro-Nazi. There was a complex history with, unfortunately, with Britain at the time, which was unfortunate for both nations that it played out when it did. The Indians, value their independence, as do many African countries. I just think we have to do what we've always done, and that is to work and build relationships. The one thing that the United Kingdom is uniquely good at, and arguably part of our strategic culture, and a very important part of it, is that there's probably no nation on earth in the past 200-300 years that has been as good as we are in developing relationships with countries and developing allies, whether that was, being able to rely on German mercenaries to fight our wars in the 17th and 18th centuries, whether it was the development of alliances through the development of the empire and dominions in the 19th and 20th centuries. But it is something that we have been spectacularly good at. And we, along with the other Western world, have got to fight for, to make sure that our voice is heard and our values are A, respected, and B, eventually people sign up to those values. I do think it would be arrogant for us just to assume that because we're the West, that people are going to rush to support us, especially because we've got some things wrong in the past. Afghanistan, Iraq haven't been great triumphs, let's be honest. It's important for us not to have too short of memories. So we have to work with a sense of modesty and determination. And we know that, at our best, our values are the right ones for the future of humanity.
Great. Anders, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, 2 points. First, when this resolution was up in the UN General Assembly, was it 2014 or 2015, there were only 101 votes for it. This time it was 141 votes. So that's a big fact difference.
Yeah.
And the second point is that since for the last 15 years, democracy has declined in the world. So the countries mentioned now, none of them is ranked as a free country. Well, there are 91 free countries in the world according to Freedom House. So India has clearly declined, so has Brazil, so has South Africa. So these are the 2 elements that I would like to emphasize.
Very good point. Okay, Vadym, I'm going to give you the last word.
Just one word on, if I may, on China and India.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably the beggars couldn't be pickers. So when the time will come, we will have to rely on each and every dollar which will be able to be used for our reconstruction. At the same time, we have to be very careful with where China is driven, where the most in its sectors. They've been working very elaborately to get into the strategic points, like this motor siege, probably you heard about this problem, or ports, infrastructure in Ukraine. There we have to keep in mind that we have to be careful. Generous, yes, they are, but they also have their interests, and sometimes these interests won't be coinciding with ours in the long run. I mean,
you make a very good point, and that's probably a good point on which to end. So I would like to say thank you very much to everybody who took part. Especially, I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists, I think it's been a very rich discussion, and I hope very much that we will see a Marshall Plan or whatever it will be called for Ukraine in the near future, and that we'll be able to sit down again in a couple of years' time and see the Ukrainian economy flourishing again while the Russian economy is languishing. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists.